Hey gardeners, Lindsay here with the Mindful Living Movement, and today we're going to talk about drip irrigation. So this is going to be your beginner's guide, bottom to top, how to figure out what kind of drip irrigation system you should be using in your garden and actually how to map out the parts and pieces to create the system. There is a lot of things, a lot of pieces. It's kind of like Lego when you're sitting down. You get all these things, and how do you put it together in a way that's going to work for you? Or you're standing in the store going, do I need this or do I need that? So I'm going to show you all the different little things to consider, how I use them in my garden, how I've connected everything. And then I'm going to take you through at the end of the video and sort of show you an actual drawing of, I'm going to make like a pretend garden, figure out where the water source is, and start to help you plan through, okay, this is the major framework. These are all the little things and where I can start to put them together so that you can come up with a shopping list. And then you can take that shopping list to your local irrigation supply store and confidently be like, all right, here's the things that I need. Now, the other magic thing about it is once you have all these parts and pieces, if you change your garden in future years and you need to update your irrigation system in future years, it is customizable. You can take it apart, you can put it back together in different ways, which is something that I have done several times. Almost every year I seem to find a new way that I want to structure my garden, or I add in a new bed or something like that, and I have to sort of modify and change. And that's the fun part, is once you've invested in it, there's so many different things that you can do. It can change with you as well. It's really, really worth the investment. And the bonus that when you use a drip irrigation system, if you're trying to be a little more eco-friendly about your water consumption, drip irrigation is exactly the way to do it. It puts the water exactly where you want it, and it's not broadcasting it all over the place to just evaporate and be wasted. You're also not having to, wet the leaves of your plants wherever possible, because that's just going to increase the chances of disease and fungal issues starting to happen. And there are many, many plants that do not like to have wet leaves, so it just reduces overall stress on your plants. So it's kind of a win-win. Let's get started. So this big black tubing that you can see running all over the place here, this is a 3/4 inch, just regular poly tubing that you can find at any hardware store. These are your main feeder lines, and you can kind of think of this like the backbone. So wherever your water source is, you're going to use these 3/4 inch lines to run kind of your main out to, like, for example, I've got 3 different zones here, so you can see 3 different tubing pathways connected. So you can do that, run your main water line, and then from there is where you start to offshoot into sort of smaller tubing. So you can see there's one little connector here for my 1/4 inch tubing. So these big fat ones, the only holes that ever will go in them are to connect your smaller actual drip tubing or maybe some overhead emitters, but overall it's just feeder line. And in this corner here you can see I've got some different valves and things connected. That's kind of what they will look like. So you've got kind of your on-off sections if you need to. You can add in different bulbs and things like that. This skinny little tubing, this is a 1/4 inch tubing. This is your drip tubing. So you can see there's little holes here all along the way. These are your emitters where the water is going to just drip right out of. This is your 6-inch spacing, and you can also get 12-inch spacing. So you would cut out this middle one and you'd have one here and one here. This 6-inch is awesome for a vegetable garden. The 12-inch I like a little more for like perennial type spacing, but the closer that they are together, the more even you're going to get for kind of the smaller plants that tend to be in a like vegetable type garden. And this is what's going to eventually connect from that big black 3/4 inch tubing. So one thing, depending on how much attention that you want to have to pay to watering things in your garden, is getting yourself some overhead emitters as well. Now you might be wondering why you would have overhead emitters when you also have drip tubing. Now this one little patch right here, as you can see, nothing is really sprouted except for elm tree weeds. And so these overhead ones, they're for direct sowing seeds into the ground. So what it's doing is it's broadcasting water over the whole top of the soil so that all those seeds evenly germinate for you. And then what I usually do, once everything is sprouted and I'm sort of happy with it, I turn off the overhead emitters completely and I leave just the drip lines to do the work over the season. Now, depending on how you want to grow, maybe like leafy greens don't usually care so much about being wet. They're pretty okay with it. So you could totally leave it watering your leafy greens if you wanted to. Things like tomatoes and stuff like that, you definitely would not want to leave your leaves being watered all season long, or cucumbers, that kind of thing. And the difference here between these two, this particular emitter is doing just 180 degrees. So I've got it on this side of the bed and it's broadcasting that way. And then that one over there is a full 360 degrees. So I've got it plunked in the middle of the bed and it's broadcasting out a big, large circle from there. And they've all got little knobs on them, so you can sort of turn them up and turn them down to cover, you know, the spacing that you're needing. So that's how I use these, is to get seeds to germinate. Or like, for example, here, you know, I've got like a few different patches of things happening. I do have some squash in the back that are getting wet that they really shouldn't be, but I'm waiting for the rest of my carrots and stuff like that to germinate, and my Swiss chard and stuff to germinate. So I'm gonna kind of have to deal with my squash getting a little bit wet right now. But eventually all of these overhead ones are going to turn off. Now, you don't need to have overhead ones. Like, you can come out here and hand water if you want to. Amazing. Once everything sprouts, then let your drip lines do the rest of the work. I'm kind of on that lazy gardener path, and so I like to automate watering completely if I can throughout the garden. You do need to pay attention and make sure that, you know, you don't have any holes and stuff like that that are being missed. Maybe you do have to hand water those holes, but I really like to use both of them in tandem with each other, because it just takes so much more off of my plate. So that's how you can use both of those guys. This is another style of emitter that you're going to see. It's kind of an overhead sprayer, but it's a little bit better for pots and stuff like that. It's a 360 degree one as well. I'm not using it in a pot necessarily. I'm just using it to sort of strategically water these little squash plants, and I like it because it's not blasting the leaves per se. It's sort of just keeping the area and the soil and the mulch and everything like that wet. So those are another really good thing that you could consider putting in pots, or sort of in a similar manner that I have here. Alternately, the skinny 1/4 inch tubing, you could run the skinny 1/4 inch tubing around and then let the little emitters kind of drip around each of the plants. So here's an example of your 3/4 inch tubing with a connector with the 1/4 inch drip tubing. And this particular drip tubing here, this is 12-inch spacing. So this is different than the one that is in my garden bed, because this is my perennial area. So I've gone with a little bit of a wider spacing. Something I just like better. If you have to choose just one, I would say go for the 6-inch versus this, because the 6-inch is a little more versatile, but that's a look at how you would connect that. A really important tip is to lay down your irrigation tubing and then stick your plant next to it, so that that emitter is right where your plant is, as opposed to sticking the plant smack in the middle. It's not going to get the watering that it needs. So plant your plants right along where all of your emitters are, so that you can maximize, especially if you're using a 12-inch spacing on your tubing. So this is a look at the whole system where it's coming out of my tap on the house. I'm just using my regular water spigot on the outside of the house. I don't have anything sort of extra fancy wired in for underground irrigation or anything like that. So just very basic, your water spout. This contraption right here, this is a filter. My water comes out of our well, so there's lots of sediment and things like that, and if I didn't have this on there, a lot of the rust and stuff that it pulls up out of the well would end up plugging all the little holes on my drip irrigation system. even if you are on city water, municipal, like central water, it's still a really good idea to get just one filter on sort of your main. You can see that this starts the process, and then here's all those 3/4 inch feeder lines. So I've got it just one, I've got one here, and then I've got another one on my other system that's coming out of the front of the yard. This little contraption, this is my timer. And this is a 4-zone timer, as you can see here. So this thing controls each of the different sections that I've got going on in the backyard here. And the reason that I have 4 zones is because, as I mentioned, I'm on a well, and our pump can only do so much water per area at a time. And what'll happen is if I end up putting too much tubing or too many emitters on any one of these sections, I start to lose pressure at the end of the line. So the little drips that are coming out of the water at the very end, they're coming out really, really slowly, but way up close to where the source of the water is coming from, they're dripping really quickly. And so I end up with uneven watering if I put too much. So by splitting it out into different pieces, I can make sure that each zone is getting even water distribution, because that's really important, right? I need to know that, you know, if I set my timer to 10 minutes, that I'm getting the same effect across the whole thing, and I'm not drowning out one area of plants and the other plants are not getting what they need to survive. So that is why I have it split up here. If you are on municipal water, as opposed to being on a well, there's a good chance that you probably won't have to split it out into multiple zones. What often happens, municipal water tends to have a little bit of a higher water pressure. And so while I'm here at the water spigot, I'm going to talk about water pressure. So an ideal water pressure for drip irrigation to get like a consistent release of water is like 30 psi, max 40 psi. But a lot of municipal systems are at like 50 to 70 psi. So something else that you may want to consider is a irrigation, what is it called? A pressure reducer. So there'd be an extra little thing that you would add into this that you would connect, and it would reduce the water coming out of here so that the pressure is not quite as great going out into the rest of your lines. I don't have that because that's not an issue that I have here. However, if you are unsure, you can actually get a pressure gauge for water lines just at any hardware store to test what is actually happening, how much pressure you have, and then decide from there if you need to actually get a pressure reducer to just help keep evenness over the whole system. So that is not something that I have. Now, I am definitely going to have a very comprehensive list of all the little parts and pieces and things like that I'm talking about here, but I want to show you in this video how everything sort of connects together, where it gets used, so when you're like, oh my gosh, do I need that, or where does it go, you can kind of see the flow of things. So I've got all of my 4 connectors. One thing that's going to be really, really handy, these things get used all over the place, is hose clamps. I usually go for like a 3/4 inch hose clamp because it's pretty universal. I can crank it down a little bit smaller if I needed to. But yeah, there's going to be a whole bunch of hose clamps that you're going to want to have on hand as well. And these guys here, so the 3/4 inch tubing, this PEX tubing, it doesn't come with the hose thing to screw on here. So you need to buy a 3/4 inch end that just pops on, put the hose clamp on, and then you've got like a regular garden hose end is basically what you're doing, is you're adding on here. So that's what you can connect to your water source if you're using this method. So a couple of those and a bunch of hose clamps is going to be really, really helpful. That irrigation tape, that white roll of tape that you wrap around before you put all your pieces together as well, that's going to be something that's going to be really helpful. You can kind of see a little bit of the white sticking out here and there. This is just going to help keep the whole thing from dripping and leaking all over the place. It will eventually, but that's also going to be a good thing to have. All right, so what you could see here is this isn't one of those on-off valves. So I've put this in here and I've connected this 1/4 inch tubing so that I have the option to actually turn off the drip tubing in this particular section just by closing off this valve. So these valves are something that I will show you in sort of the practice drawing that we use where you would kind of implement this, but it can help you to further divide out your sections basically. So if you just wanted to really, really isolate down, I only want to water this particular piece of this bed, that's what these things are going to be used for. And you're going to definitely need to have, again, Here's lots more hose clamps. These little connectors here, 3/4 inch tubing connectors, there's L's that you can get, and then there's also T's that you can get. So this is a T here that I've used 3 different hose clamps to put this whole thing together. And the other thing that we're going to need, there's lots of different versions of these, but you're going to need end caps as well. So this is one style of end cap. There's some that are much simpler that you would just use a hose clamp to attach as well. So just look for an end cap, because you're going to have to sort of stop your 3/4 line tubing somewhere along the way. So that's going to be another piece to consider getting. This is just a quick look. This is another style of end cap that I've got hose clamped on there. This is probably a little bit easier and more common to find, so I just wanted to kind of share that with you. That's what that would look like where I've capped off this piece. And you can see here's a few connectors of 3/4 inch tubing. This would be an overhead connector, and actually both of these are going to overhead connectors, overhead emitters, pardon me. So now that you've seen sort of the big pieces, the big fat 3/4 inch tubing, this 1/4 inch skinny drip tubing with the emitters, either 6-inch or 12-inch spacing. I've given you a look at sort of the irrigation where it's coming right out of my water tap with the filter, the timer, the hose clamps, all that kind of stuff. There's other little pieces and tools that are going to help you with this process and putting all of it together. The first thing that you're really going to want to get yourself is a pipe cutter, or borrow one if you can. This is amazing, makes very quick work of cutting the big tubing. You just put the tubing in here, clamp it down, you just give it a spin all the way around and it cuts it. It actually works for the little stuff as well, the 1/4 inch tubing. I use this as well to cut 1/4 inch tubing, so if you don't have one of those on hand, I would definitely get that. The other thing that you're going to need is these little connector pieces. These connector pieces are what goes into the 3/4 inch tubing and then also gets connected to the 1/4 inch. So here's one, this is one that actually broke off, so that sometimes happens over the winter time. So there was part of it there. So you're gonna need a bunch of these guys. And there is, a tool that you use. So this is kind of a little multi-tool. This little pokey here, this is for punching a hole into the 3/4 inch tubing. And then once you've got your hole in the 3/4 inch tubing, then it's much easier to put this in there. So this one has a little hole in the bottom, and you pop it into this side, and then you use this to just punch the connector right into the 3/4 inch tubing. Once this is in the 3/4 inch tubing, then you can grab your skinny 1/4 inch and plug it into that, and then you are good to go. Now, something that I haven't talked about yet is there is tubing, the 1/4 inch tubing that doesn't have drip emitters in it, and that stuff is what you're going to want to use for the overhead connectors. So this skinny tubing here has none of those little drip emitters along it, like the ones I've showed you already with the 6-inch and the 12-inch spacing, because if you did that, you'd lose all the pressure to your overhead emitter here. And this whole piece with the spike on the bottom, the connector on the top, and this little tube here, this is something I bought ready to go from a local irrigation company. But you can actually buy all the little parts that go into that separately. So if you're brand new to this, I might recommend staying away from really getting into the fine, tiny little pieces. But if you look here, this is one of the overhead connectors. This is sort of the tall spike that gives it height. I don't have one of the bottom pieces, but you can see here, that's kind of how it breaks down. So this is what I started with when I was really brand new to all of this. They just had it all assembled and everything ready to go for me, which was amazing. And this little tube sticking out the top here, you can just kind of cut it down to whatever height you want to. So you don't have to leave these really tall, like you can drop them down really low if you want to, which is kind of cool. So you can really customize from there. So that would be what I would recommend with. But if you can't find that, you can very easily usually find all the rest of the other pieces. The average hardware store doesn't always have everything. They'll be a little bit limited, but your actual irrigation companies, they should have a plethora of all of these little parts and pieces to help you out with assembling it. Now, what else can I share with you? Your little connector tool here, this is your best friend because otherwise you are not gonna be able to poke holes in your tubing and stuff like that. So using this little pointy end, these little tools, they do look different as well. I've seen a few different varieties, but you've got a pointy end that you use for punching a hole in your 3/4 inch tubing. And then there's usually a little spot here that has a spot that your connector goes into. So the connector goes into that. And then you just use the tool to punch this right into the hole that you just created. After that, the tubing connects right onto it. So you're definitely gonna need one of these tools. Again, an actual irrigation company, if they're setting you up with all of this stuff, they will provide this for you. But if not, if you're just kind of customing it all yourself, definitely get one of these guys because you will need that. And that's kind of the gist of it. So big fat 3/4 inch tubing, and then you're going to connect either your overhead emitters or your regular drip tubing with the emitters to it, or both, which is what I have. I have the regular drip tubing that runs around through the garden, and I also have the overhead emitters that help me with sort of that seeding of, you know, the seeds or bulbs or whatever it is that I've stuck into the ground. So now that I've shared with you all the parts and pieces that you're going to need to worry about, you're probably thinking, oh, how in the world do I put that all together? So this is where I'm going to show you where you start with your drawing of your garden and spend a fair bit of time really sort of humming and hawing and pondering maybe the different ways that you might want to water your garden. First things first, ask yourself, do you want to overhead spray, you know, or do you want to hand water? If you're good with just hand watering your seeds into your soil, you're not going to need to worry about the overhead emitters. But if you like the idea, like how I have with the overhead emitters that are watering the seeds into the soil, eventually you turn these off and just the little drip tubing does the rest of the work for the season. I'm going to show you how to consider both of those things, but it's important that you ask that question now. Because, you know, a month into your season when your tubing's all in your garden and your plants are starting to sprout, it's kind of a pain to start climbing around and actually, you know, plugging extra things into what you've already got set up. You absolutely can do it. It's not a final thing, but it's good to just sort of think it through a little bit. Also to help you if you maybe put too many holes in things, you don't have holes to plug. I have not mentioned actually that as well. There are little plugs as well. So if you accidentally poke holes into things and then you change your mind and you're like, oh crap, now what? You can buy plugs for your holds for your 3/4 inch tubing as well. That is going to be something that you're definitely going to want to have. Whether you make a mistake or whether you just change up your irrigation from season to season, definitely you're going to want to get some of the little plugs as well to keep on hand because you never know when you're going to need those. So let's dive into how you would map out what you're gonna need and what you need to go shopping for. So I'm gonna share with you sort of how you would begin to plot out what tubing and things you might need. So this is my pretend garden bed here. I've got 6 beds. Each of these beds is 4 feet by 4 feet, which is pretty standard. You can get a lot of, you know, ready-made raised beds in that, so that's kind of what I'm going with here. Now I do have, this is my water, so I'm saying this is my water source and where I need to start running all of the things from. So from my water source, I'm going to need to add on first a filter, very important. Optionally, a timer. So timer is going to be kind of our next thing down the line. And then from our timer, we're going to be able to connect kind of our water, our main water feeding lines. So I'm going to go on the outside of each of these, assuming that you maybe walk down the middle of this. Completely up to you. So, but my 3/4 inch line, so from my water source, obviously this is not quite as good, pretty as it could be, but my 3/4 inch line, I'm going to do one big solid line all the way across the end here. So this is my big 3/4 inch. And then I'm going to run a 3/4 inch straight across this way. I'm going to have a corner, and then I'm going to come straight down this way. So that's my big 3/4 inch. Now, something that you're going to need to note here is you're going to need an L corner piece, and you're probably going to need some hose clamps. At the end of each of these here, you're going to need end caps, probably also hose clamps. So both of these are going to be the same. And this is, you're writing these things down however you want, just so you know what you're going to need when you go shopping. So you can start to make a list of like, okay, 2 more hose clamps, 5 more hose clamps, whatever it is. From where you're connecting here, probably you're going to need, you know, a couple, say 2 more hose clamps on each. And you're going to need those 3/4 inch hose connectors, because that black tubing doesn't naturally come with that connector, and you're going to need to screw it onto your water source. So you can start to kind of make those notes as it comes across. And then what I'm going to do is I've got the 3/4 inch tubing sort of hanging out on the back side of each of these beds, and then from there I can run it inwards. So I've decided in my plan, because what I like to do is I like the overhead emitters for seed starting. So I'm going to go with 360 degree emitter in each of these beds. And the 360 degree emitters, they easily cover a 4-foot bed. So this would be perfect. So just for efficiency's sake, this is going to be exactly what I need. So I'm going to have 1 of each of those. So I know when I'm shopping, I need 6 of the I need 6 360 degree emitters, which means that the water is going to shoot out in all directions. So it's going to cover that space really well for me. The other thing that I'm going to need tubing connecting from my main line to my emitter. So the red is going to be my 1/4 inch tubing here. So that's 1/4 inch. So I'm going to need that on each of these. And I'm connecting it all the way, oops, sorry, I should connect it all the way to the water source. There we go. Connecting it all the way to my water source. There we go. So that can tell me how much of that I need. And eventually, if I want to use drip line running throughout the bed, once I turn off the overhead, so remember we had 2 different drip lines that either had a 6-inch spacing or a 12-inch spacing. So what I can do is also connect it from the main line here, and I'm just going to put a whole nother hole in the line, and I'm going to run little rows. So this is one of the things that I like to do, is I just like to zigzag back and forth across the bed for my drip line. And there's lots of different ways. You can go around in circles if you want to. You can lay it out all sorts of different ways. The one thing I haven't talked about yet, but there are little clips, because sometimes the lines don't actually lay where you want them to, so you can clip the line in place so that it does have that nice even spacing for you. So I'm going to need enough spacing to cover that. And this is something that you can talk to the irrigation company and say, you know, I've got 4x4 beds, and they can give you sort of the square footage of what you might need to cover that as well. So now that I know, now I've got 1/4 inch with no holes, and I've got 1/4 inch with 6-inch drip emitters. So we need to know that we actually need 2 different 1/4 inch, because I've got the one without the holes going to my emitters, and then I've got the one with the holes that's going to snake back and forth across my bed. Now to plug holes on the 1/4 inch, you can actually just use the regular little hole plugs that you would use on this big fat tubing, like if you made an oops or you changed or something like that. So once you have those hole plugs, that's perfect. And you're going to need connectors. So you're going to need the little 1/4 inch connector pieces, and you're going to need the tool that goes with it. So this is super, super basic, but this kind of gives you the idea. Start with your main line. This is going to give you that source to connect all the little pieces off to. And if you want to add, I don't know, say you want to add some pots on the corners, you know, in future seasons or even this season, awesome. You can totally do that. Then you just go and you want another little emitter in the center to water each of these guys. You can go for put one in each of those. Get some more of your 3/4 inch tubing that does not have holes in it, connect it to your main line, and that's what you can do, is you can keep connecting things to the main source. But you've got those main lines as your framework to work everything else off of. So do up a plan like this to give you the idea of, okay, this is what I'm gonna need, and then also keep yourself a little shopping list going so that you know, okay, these are all the other things that I'm going to need while I'm out and about. You're gonna have to go back and forth in the store a few times. That's just kind of how it goes. But hopefully this gives you an idea of how that will work. Okay, gardeners, this is drip irrigation for beginners. Now, I know that that is a lot of information that I just threw at you. There's a lot of tiny little pieces that go into it to put it all together, but take your time, you know, really spend time on the plan part of it so that you have a very clear idea of what you need for pieces and things like that, that when you go shopping, it's really easy to not get overwhelmed by all the things. You can just buy what you need to buy and not spend a whole crazy amount of money, because irrigation is a little bit of an investment. However, it's gonna last you for years and years and years. And as I mentioned, you can customize it, you can change it. You know, from my initial probably 1 to 2 investments in all of the things, I have very rarely had to buy any new parts and pieces since. It's probably been 4 years since I put maybe more than like 50 bucks into it. The odd connector that I break off, or I want a new overhead emitter or something like that. But after that, it's really fantastic. It can customize for you. You can plug holes wherever you might need to. But the reason that I say spend the time with the plan at the beginning of your season or when you're first starting to put it all together is so that you can kind of do it once and not have to keep fixing holes and stuff like that, or even splicing lines together. It can be done. It's just a pain, and I don't want you to have to worry about that as much as you can. So I wish you the best of luck. Please let me know if there's anything that I can assist you with. You may have to go back and forth from the store that you get all your irrigation stuff a few times, because you might find something new that you need to have, or you might forget something. It's just kind of how it goes, unfortunately. But once it is together and once it is operational, you will be so, so happy with it. And my last piece of advice is, even though it is a set it forget it thing and you do not have to pay attention to your garden watering very often, still every once in a while when your timer goes off, if that's what you're using, just watch what's happening. Make sure nothing's broken, you don't have water squirting in weird places, an end cap didn't pop off or something like that, because that can happen. Also, make sure that you are adjusting your timer if you're using a timer, because maybe you're having a really hot spell and you need to increase the length of time so your plants get more water, or maybe you're getting a bunch of rain. Obviously, you're not going to want to run your irrigation system. Make sure you turn it off, or use, like, if there's a rain delay feature on it, pause it for a day, 2 days, whatever it is. So it is set it and forget it, but sometimes that might not be a good thing. So just pay attention to it. I'm guilty of this. The pieces I've bust off because I've stepped on them or something like that, and I didn't realize till 2 weeks later, until my plants were really sad. So speaking from experience, do your best. Try and, you know, take a quick look around maybe once a week or something like that, and make sure everything is still functioning accordingly. Happy gardening, and we will see you again. Have a beautiful rest of your day.